Hello, everybody, and welcome. Give us about 1 minute. We've got attendees flowing in. We'll wait for things to slow down ever so slightly, and we will get started. Thanks for joining. Right, it looks like the trickling in of attendees is slowing down. We've got a jam-packed, exciting hour. So without further ado, I will kick us off here. Welcome, everybody. I can't believe it is now the 20th episode of When Things Go Wrong. Any correlation to 420? I don't think we could have planned that a year and a half ago when we started this webinar and envisioned it. So thank you so much for coming. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I pass it over to Bethany. As many of you know, I am David Vaillencourt, the CEO and founder of the GMP Collective. Excited to bring this educational series to you all. It is free. We keep these posted. We post all these on our YouTube channel to watch later. We also post them up on our website at gmpcollective.com, so you can learn more information there. If you have questions for our panelists, thank you for, we got several Q&As submitted during the registration process, but if something comes up that inspires you, use the Q&A feature and we'll do our best to fit that in. We do have a jam-packed session, and with that, without further ado, let me hand it over to you, Bethany, to get us going.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to be your moderator of When Things Go Wrong, where we discuss various challenges and issues within the cannabis industry with the aim of offering valuable insights, tips, and solutions. I'm the Director of Content Strategy and Market Growth at the GMP Collective, and I'm excited to continue working with experts in the cannabis and hemp industry. You can contact the GMP Collective today or anytime to learn more about our services, including technical and strategic advising, client referral programs, and webinar sponsorship opportunities. Anyway, let's get started with this webinar. You all know David Vaillencourt, CEO of the GMP Collective, co-founder of S3 Collective, and vice chair of ASTM International Committee D37 on cannabis. Our first guest is Dr. Gillian Schauer, who's the executive director of the Cannabis Regulators Association, which is a nonpartisan association of government agencies regulating cannabis, cannabinoids, and/or hemp across more than 45 states and U.S. territories, Canada, and the Netherlands. She previously worked with state and federal agencies on tobacco policy and cannabis policy. She has a PhD in public health and behavioral science. Welcome to the panel today, Gillian. And also welcoming Martin Woodbridge. He's provided regulatory policy and advice on cannabis-based medicines in Asia, Australasia, and Europe, and for the United Nations INCB. In North America, he's a member of ASTM, working on the collaborative development of quality standards. In this webinar, he'll also speak about the ASTM USP Cannabis Quality Workshop Report, recently published by the US Pharmacopoeia. We'll share that link later. Welcome, Martin. So I want to start this webinar with a wonderful phrase I found from the US Pharmacopoeia. Cannabis can't cross borders, but our science can. And that's a little true, right? Plus, we will talk more about that ASTM USP workshop happening June 10th in Philadelphia. It is free for ASTM members or $115 for the public, but that's the same cost as a year-long membership with ASTM, so you may as well join. We'll talk more about that later. Let's start with our first question. What are the biggest challenges regulators are facing? How does it differ by jurisdiction, whether it's the state model in the United States, and by cannabis versus hemp. Gillian, if you could kick us off.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. These sessions that you've been putting on through the GMP Collective have been really useful. So it's an honor to be part of one. So thanks for having me. I think I want to start this question by just clarifying for folks on the line the role that regulators have. I think there are a lot of misperceptions about what regulators do and what they're charged with doing. One of those misperceptions is, I think a lot of people feel like their regulator is the reason they have the policies that they do in their jurisdiction. And that's usually not the case. Regulators are usually the implementers. They are taking policies that are passed, in this case, by state legislatures or sometimes by countries, and they are implementing them and trying to make them work. They work with lots of stakeholders in that process. I think that's also a misperception. The industry is a really important stakeholder, but not the only stakeholder that they work with and need to listen to and hear from. And I think folks can often be confused about what the goal of a regulatory agency is. And that I really do see that differ across states, but they all share something in common, and that is consumer safety. Every state, regardless of their political background or the makeup of their state or population, the regulator is charged with keeping consumers safe. And that's a big reason for the regulations that they're trying to implement. So I like to start any conversation with that just to sort of get on the table where regulators are in this. Now, as implementers of policy, I think there have been some challenges that are common across states, even though we see a pretty heterogeneous approach to policy for cannabis and now also for hemp. Some of the common challenges have been there almost since the beginning of this experiment in states. Lab testing and product safety continues to be a challenge. This is a really fast-moving area for regulators and policymakers. We're still lacking validated methods. We're still lacking approaches to make sure that products are being looked at to make sure that they're safe in the right ways. The illicit market, while it looks different in every state, it exists in every state and continues to be a challenge that I think both lawmakers and regulators are thinking about. How do you bring more operators from the illicit space into the licit space, and what are the policy levers that do that? But I think there are a couple of huge issues that, especially in the past few years, have been challenges to states. One is regulating without federal minimum standards. And that's true for both cannabis and for hemp. We don't have a federal regulator. Cannabis is still Schedule 1, as everyone on the call knows, maybe soon to be Schedule 3. And hemp, while it's federally legal, does not have a regulator for cannabinoid hemp finished products at the federal level. So that puts a lot of onus and pressure on states to try to figure out everything from A to Z, which is unlike any other domain that we have. We usually have a federal regulator setting minimum standards, creating sort of a structure for regulation that states can vary and work within. We don't have that here. And so that brings me to what I think the number one common issue challenging state regulators is, and that is really the landscape with cannabinoid hemp. It's come up as a large industry very fast. It is a challenging space for state regulators to keep consumers safe because a lot of regulators don't have authority to regulate cannabinoid hemp products. And even if they do, even if their state legislature has acted to try to provide some authority or some regulatory structure, they don't have authority usually over the e-commerce space and interstate commerce. And so, there are certainly, as I always like to remind folks, a lot of good actors in the cannabinoid hemp space, but there are also some bad actors. And the purpose of regulation is really to set those minimum standards for public health and safety. And we don't have those at the federal level. So that's been a huge challenge. Regulators have spent hours, through CANNRA committees, talking with each other, talking with their staff and team in their own states to try to figure out what can we do to keep consumers safe? How can we make sure that these products are only available if they are safe? I think there's some additional challenges that differ across states. I really just sort of went through some of the ones that I think are common across states. There are a number of states that have programs to try to lift up equity and small business. Those continue to be challenging. Nobody has all the answers about how to do that in the right way. And I think intentions are good, but we also have a lot of discussions at CANNRA about those. What policies might work better? How could you do a better job in this space? I think importantly, how do you lift up and advance equity as markets are shifting more towards cannabinoid hemp? That's a big question I have. And then interstate commerce. We have some states that are very interested in interstate commerce. There are now 3 states that have passed laws through the state legislature so that the minute interstate commerce is available, the state is opted in. That's California, Washington, and Oregon. So, I think we will continue to see states look at what interstate commerce might mean for them. But we also have a bunch of East Coast states that are just standing up programs. And I think some of the discussions that they're having is, what should their program look like for a future with interstate commerce? We have interstate commerce through hemp, but when state cannabis markets can open up for interstate commerce, what will survive in the state? So I think that's a bit of a potpourri of some of the challenges that regulators face and where there are common challenges across states and where there might be some novel challenging areas that are more in focus for certain states than others. And I think we'll talk more about those, Bethany. So hopefully that sort of surface response will suffice for now.
Yep, really good groundwork laid there. Appreciate that response. It's funny thinking about California, Oregon, and Washington just kind of wanting to take over the whole West Coast there on their own. So Martin, let's shift over to the international, transnational market. What are the challenges there? Let's talk more about that.
Okay, my slides are all up.
Gotcha.
Sure. Let's a nice roll through from Gillian's commentary around regulators and their abilities. I think we've got to refocus some attention that we're dealing with one plant, but it has various uses. And indeed, that's the case in all jurisdictions across the world. They are used to varying degrees where it's permitted. And it's useful at that time to think about, when we're looking at use, what is the segmentation of those markets? How do we define them and license them? Because this is the biggest challenge that we're seeing, not only within the US, but right across the globe often, and it can cause a lot of impediments. So if we look at medical use, and what it refers to is the classification of cannabis sativa in the context of the United Nations Drug Control Conventions, in particular 1961, and the use of cannabinoids for medical and scientific purposes. So medical use meaning typically the treatment or prevention of a disease, medicines. And that's defined well, and it's licensed in multiple jurisdictions in accordance with those UN drug control conventions. So we start from that international signatory level and then move down to domestic settings where licensing for medical use is quite common now across the world. And then we have industrial use. So that refers to that botanical class. It's still cannabis sativa L, but cultivars grown specifically for industrial and horticultural use with a THC concentration between 0.2, 0.3, but that varies by jurisdiction. And again, in the context of the regulatory framework across the globe, setting with the UN conventions, the conventions do not apply when it is that plant, the cannabis plant, is used for industrial purposes or horticultural purposes. And then adult consumer use, which refers to that diverse group of cannabis-derived adult consumer products, commonly intended for enjoyment or wellness purposes, and adult consumer purchases those goods and services, but that is typically illegal in most countries if we're looking at this in a global context. And indeed, the variability of the segments of the market across the states is also quite clear and prominent. Some states allow only the medical use, while other states allow all three. And they are defined and they are licensed well. And I think the Farm Bill is one example of the licensing structures that will occur. The definitions of hemp are well outlined within the Farm Bill and the acts that will result from that in the US settings. So we can understand, you know, when we split and segment the markets, we can understand their use a bit more clearly, and it's much the ability for regulators to actually control those markets or influence those markets and monitor them is much easier when they are appropriately licensed and there's ring fence in terms of their activities. So that's one of the biggest sections. And why is that important? Because associated with each three of those sort of markets or use categories are different sets of quality expectations and minimum standards associated with them. Now, we would expect that you know, that differential in quality expectation between an adult consumer product or an industrial hemp product to be the difference that would likely reflect an increase in patient safety from a medicine's perspective. And so understanding and making sure that we have clarity around what are the use areas or segments of the market, and that we're dealing with one plant, but just multiple uses is a very important aspect for across the globe, and probably one of the biggest challenges that I think we face currently. And from there, standards is really important. So what we've done to try to address some of this and get the dialogue going about, you know, what are these markets and why are they different? David and I actually last year published this with ASTM, published this article, Adult Consumer Use versus Medical Use. Now, Bethany, I'm sure, can share that in the chat, but also you can easily search this online, and it really sets the tone for a good, robust discussion going ahead. It's not about trying to come at loggerheads with industries or segments of their markets. It's rather about clearly defining them in order that we can talk effectively about them and to create standards. Now, the next kind of way that we're trying to address this and get that dialogue going is with an upcoming workshop, which Bethany just described earlier, and that's looking at the cannabis quality. So exploring the barriers, gaps, opportunity for global standards. And that will occur on Monday, the 10th of June at the ASTM Committee Week in Philadelphia. Now, as Bethany also suggested, do come along. I encourage you to attend as a member, because then you can be part of the process, which actually looks to address the recommendations of quality workshops that were undertaken across the globe in collaboration with the United States Pharmacopoeia. Now, this global focus aimed to highlight, illuminate some of the issues that are facing the globe from a regulatory, standards organization, industry, and laboratory perspective. And we really got some high-level experts from different parts of the world, as you can see, New Zealand all the way through Asia, into Europe, North America, and South America, and sub-Saharan Africa through representation by South Africa. And the outcome of this will be, or has been, the publication of this recommendations report, which we addressed at the Philadelphia workshop. And our focus will be on flower first, because from a medicines perspective, and indeed the wider industry perspective, cannabis sativa flower is the building block. And so to get things right and address the real issues that are surrounding standards and practices around the quality of cannabis flower is really where we should start. And at the sessions, we have 5 rapids, 40-minute sessions where we will look at the findings from the global workshops and focus first on the standardization of cultivation. So again, flower first, to then the dried flower itself, and addressing some of the issues around the implications of the new monograph out of Europe and the USP cannabis inflorescence monograph. The third will look at the contaminants of that flower, in particular focusing on pesticide contamination and the importance of a global data source for pesticides, and then looking at sampling of the dried flower and the preparation of them, particularly difficult because it has implications for laboratory processes, contaminants, assay, etc. And then finally, we will finish by looking at validation and accreditation of laboratories who undertake all the analysis. So we start with standardization of cultivation and then really the standardization of laboratory practices in order that we can focus on flower. So I do encourage you all to come to Philadelphia to the ASTM Committee Week, because this is really the start of a true global approach to harmonization of standards and practices, which really will is one of the biggest challenges to industry, but also to regulators.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Martin. It was great to see that visualization of the gap of expected consumer safety. I think that was a helpful visual. And I see some of the questions are coming in that relate to some of what you were sharing. We will have some time to address some of those questions that came in later on toward the end of the presentation. So then what challenges have you been hearing from cannabis and hemp industry operators that they're facing? And are they different across countries? Are there any differences in location as far as what those challenges may be?
So I can speak to some of the challenges that I think are unique to the US setting that are maybe not as true in other countries. I think in the cannabis industry, banking continues to really be a challenge, and to be even more challenging for small and equity operated businesses. I'm in Washington State, where we've had legalization for 10 years, and there are still many operators that struggle to get banking, that struggle to find funding. So that's a challenge. And I think the reality is that a lot of cannabis businesses are struggling to keep their businesses running because they still have 280E. They're struggling with banking. And the market is changing as we have, cannabinoid hemp more widely available and available where people buy groceries and gas. And whatever you may think of that, I think the reality is that that has created even more challenges for state regulated cannabis businesses. And they don't have interstate commerce either. So they continue to be challenged with having to set up everything within the confines of a state landscape. For hemp, I think the challenge is, and I should say, I think the hemp situation that we have in the United States, the pervasiveness of cannabinoid hemp products is somewhat unique. We work a lot with Canada, and they don't have those same issues in Canada because they have federal legalization. But I think the hemp industry, is struggling from the lack of federal regulatory engagement to create minimum standards. And I talk, almost daily with trade associations and operators who, are part of those trade associations who desperately want regulatory certainty. It's very hard to operate a business when you don't have regulatory certainty, and who want to see those minimum standards to protect their risk in this space. All it takes is one bad actor using one, solvent that's an issue or diluent that's an issue, or having one bad reaction. And, that could result in a major public health issue. And if folks can remember back to the vaping lung injury outbreak, it took months to figure out what the cause of that was, during which time the entire industry was in question. So I think that's one reason that we should all be fighting for regulatory minimum standards. And I know that that's a challenge in the hemp space. And I think for both cannabis and hemp, they both are struggling with a lack of regulatory certainty, especially at the federal level, as it's uncertain where cannabis will be rescheduled, how that will impact markets. It's uncertain what will happen with the Farm Bill. And both cannabis and hemp continue to have a patchwork of policies that exist across states. And some of that patchwork, I think, will probably live on in perpetuity. We see that on the liquor side, right? Every state has some different policies, but what's different is on the liquor side, there are some federal minimum standards. There's a sort of backbone that states are building on, and we don't have that for either cannabis or for cannabinoid hemp. So those are some of the challenges that I hear routinely from the industry about. And just, again, want to put a plug in that I'm happy to hear from and speak with, anybody at the national level. So if I got any of those wrong, or if I missed any challenges that, your industry is facing, I'd love for you to reach out so that I can make sure that we're understanding the landscape well.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. It reminds me of when Massachusetts had a temporary ban on all vaping products for a few months there while they were trying to figure out the root cause of the vitamin E acetate vaping scenario. David, you might have something to add to this as well.
Yeah, I think building on what Gillian and Martin, presented and spoke about, the key word that I picked up on that I like to repeat that Gillian said is certainty. There's a lack of certainty, period. No matter what state you're operating in or what marketplace. And why is there a lack of certainty? To me, it's indisputable that it's a lack of standards. And however you define those standards, whether you look at that as the regulations that provide the minimum framework of what you need to meet, whether they're voluntary consensus standards that are adopted or used by industry, just period, like between the marketplace, how do you operate without a common language? This absence of standards, really is driving a race to the bottom because there is no bottom at this point, right? Like, where do you even begin? What is the minimum level is what we're thinking about with standards. And I think that's where, one of the, I'll say frustrations for lack of a better word, is that, but I do think it's an educational opportunity because this has never happened before in the world, right? Where we've taken a prohibited illicit product that globally has been restricted very strongly and then unleashed it into the world. We've done this is a state experiment, but then at the federal level from a, hemp cannabinoid marketplace, that has all of a sudden kind of exploded because of the Farm Bill. And without getting into, why and who's to blame, none of that matters because the fact is it's here today and it's challenging. But it creates an opportunity. And that kind of dives into a couple of the great questions that we've seen show up in the Q&A. One that I'll address as part of this point is, if possible, how is the industry managing these multiple associations created each to develop their own set of cannabis quality standards? And I'd like to frame that in the context of we've got multiple states that if you're operating in Colorado where I live, you're probably part of your Colorado Trade Association. They're looking within the confines of the boundaries of the legislative sessions in the state level and within the regulations that, through the MED and CDPH&E. But something's happening in Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico and Massachusetts, and that all has an impact. So how do we go to this global lens where Martin's looking at, where you saw 13 nations there represented between those two workshops that are going to be culminated as a summary in Philadelphia, and then down to the state level where it's affecting your business day to day. Well, we need to work towards a unified voice. Kudos to Gillian and CANNRA because you're a staff of one, and if I am correct in recalling, and you've got 700 or so regulators across 45 states and 2 countries to try to
Yeah,
get.
I'm happy to say I have some amazing part-time consultants who are helping me now. So it's not just me, which is great. But yeah, our network has more than 900 regulators from across 45 states, 2 territories, Canada and the Netherlands. So it's important because we're able to bring together not just decision makers from regulatory agencies, but also the staff that are doing the work day to day to compare notes, to understand, to troubleshoot. And we don't just convene the regulatory agencies. We also convene a lot of the ancillary agencies that have something to do with it, whether it's traffic safety or public health or energy and environment. I mean, we have a very active energy and environment committee focused on minimizing waste. And so yes, thanks for the plug. We run on our membership, so it's good that we have so many active members.
Thanks for jumping in and sharing that, Gillian, for perspective, because I give that as a call to the industry and all their stakeholders to work together. It's not about it's like harmonization per se or unanimity, alignment, and consensus, but it's about convergence, right? And working together. And the more we can be swimming in roughly the same direction or sailing in roughly the same direction, the more we can get to the end goal, which I think everyone would agree is market certainty in protecting public health and safety. And if we can all take that as individuals to say, how do we work together? How do we identify and reconcile our differences to bring a unified voice? It's going to make things a lot easier to get at the federal level or the international level to actually make an impact. I think I'll just leave with my last analogy that I like is, when I did a lot of work as a government contractor and, and folks would get frustrated with the process. And one of the things I would say is start your expectations as low as possible. Take your expectations bar, find the construction site outside and put it down there. You can't trip over it. And that's because we need to start somewhere. But as an industry, we have so much power and opportunity. We didn't get here by just accepting that prohibition was a thing. So let's raise that bar and have minimum standards so that the race to the bottom doesn't impact all of us as consumers, as users, and as, you know, advocates of public health and safety in a fair marketplace.
And David, there's some interesting, oh, go ahead, Martin.
After
Oh, I
you.
was going to say there's some interesting parallels. You know, we have such a variety of states in our membership and governments. They don't all agree, right? They all have different policies and politics and people and, you know, geographic location. And I think the power is coming together to share experiences and context. And I am always amazed at how regulators learn from each other, even despite some really big differences across their states on paper. You know, they are going through the same challenges, much like the industry is going through the same challenge. And so I think keeping open ears and listening is critical, a foundation for moving forward in anything. Go ahead, Martin.
I think both of you have talked about convergence there and the importance of trade as well, both interstate and global, because what was identified in those two workshops, the global workshops between ASTM and USP, really identified and will be addressed in those workshop sessions in Philadelphia with some key issues that cut across all of the segments that I discussed, all parts of industry, including cultivation, the aspect of assay and ensuring that it's consistent through time, the problem of pesticides, how to actually sample, and the role of the analytical laboratory and its capacity, you know, are all aspects that are fraught across all of industry, but particularly so, you know, from the medicines perspective. That's what was highlighted in the recommendations report.
And Martin, I think, oh, go ahead.
Well, just the implementation of standards and the consistency, not only within the US, but across the globe, really will help with trade. And so we termed it harmonization, but convergence more towards actually some standards and practices that are more consistent will improve the ability of industry long-term, but also improve the access to these particular products as they are appropriately licensed by those segments of industry. If I might just, you know, in that same context of medicine, if I might just answer one of the audience questions around what is medicine and why is it, you know, what are the standards higher in difference compared to adult consumer products, for example. And I think that's an important definition to make, because remember, we're dealing with the accessibility of medicines is for patients and for the treatment of disease. And often we're dealing with ill people. And when people are in that state, then, you know, quality really matters and consistency really matters for medicines. And a higher quality standards is important because we're dealing with a particularly ill people. So the alignment with the alignment of quality more close or towards typical medicine also helps with the engagement of prescribers and pharmacies within that whole process, and that prescriber pharmacy model of care, which is really important to medicine usage, the safety of medicines, and patient well-being. And I think that all comes back to the development of standards, because ASTM's role is actually a public health role, and it's all around quality and safety.
That's great.
Yeah, Martin, I was just going to chime in that I appreciate you calling out that, you know, different countries face similar problems. I think that's why our CANNRA membership expanded to the international realm. It was because we were having engagement and questions. And even despite different regulatory models, there are a lot of the same foundational questions, and they do often come back to how do we keep this product safe? You know, how do we allow businesses to function within the purview of a structure that keeps the product safe, and what are those minimum standards?
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. And so, you know, we'll all of us, I believe, will be in Philadelphia live in person. We'll be addressing those key topics from, you know, standardization of cultivation through to analytical procedures. And I think when we start elucidating or finding solutions for the building block of industry, much more strength will come to industry and regulators as a result.
Right.
Clarity is the key, I think, here as well, that industry and regulators are speaking the same language and be able to effectively work within frameworks that will improve things markedly.
Not only be swimming in the right direction, but also not feel like salmon swimming upstream. Everything we were just talking about segues into the next couple of questions we have here. I want to talk a bit more about interstate commerce. It's still a bit of a daydream here. California, Oregon, and Washington are just ready to go. But as long as regulatory frameworks continue to be different in this patchwork way from place to place, it'll continue to present challenges for businesses operating in multiple states or who wish to operate in multiple states. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Gillian?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think interstate commerce is here already. It's here through legacy markets that have been interstate, for decades, for centuries, arguably. It's here through cannabinoid hemp, which can be sold online, which can be sold across state lines. And it's here through maybe a newer illicit space where we do see products that go from one state to another, often prominent brands. So it's here. I think it's just not here for the state regulated cannabis sector. But I also think that as it opens up even more, it does present challenges for states because of where the state regulated landscape started, with every state having to create everything in that state, from cultivation to manufacturing and processing facilities to retail to labs. It all has to live within the confines of that state. And so I think one of the challenging discussions that we have been having at CANNRA for over a year now is really challenging states to think about what they want their landscape to look like, what they think their landscape will look like when all of the boundaries drop, and what will be particularly successful in their state. I think every state will have retail. I think, many states will have thriving manufacturing and processing. I think all states will have cultivation for craft cannabis, but will all states have cultivation in large scale? I don't know. I think that's a question that regulators are trying to figure out, and they're trying to figure out how to not be creating business scenarios where people end up getting hurt and going out of business when interstate commerce happens. And that's a tough reality. Some of the newer states on the Eastern Corridor that are literally at the drawing board now, talking about should they legalize or not, and how should they do it. That's one of the insights I have for them, is to think carefully about what your market will look like in not just interstate commerce landscape, but multinational landscape as well. Because I think the more forward-thinking folks can be in setting up the parameters for their market, the more successful businesses will be that start today and tomorrow in succeeding in that landscape.
Absolutely. Martin.
Yeah, from a transnational trade perspective, because we're dealing with international conventions, we're typically dealing with controlled or non-controlled substances. So the controlled aspect may be would likely be a medicine, being able to be shipped from one country to the next, well as a non-controlled cannabis substance would be an industrial hemp product. So we're dealing with kind of different restrictions, licensing requirements, standards and practices, particularly with the transport of medicines. Standards and practices is defined also by the licensing. So with effective trade, we need standards, practices, and clear licensing about what is the product and how it's in order for it to be able to move across the world. And typically that's, with medicines is GMP, and it's appropriate that the GMP Collective is running this today. But if we're looking at it from a wider perspective, and again, focusing back to cannabis flower, the European Pharmacopoeia's recent publication of the monograph for cannabis flower, cannabis floss, dried, will have implications across the globe, particularly for flower. And that means products which are shipped will be, or will likely be, of a higher quality. It will reduce the movement of poorer quality substances within the field of medicine. So the implications of the European Pharmacopoeia's monograph are quite extensive for the medicines industry.
Yeah, I'll jump in to just add and round this out. I think it's really important to think about back to the, shout out to the US Pharmacopoeia for their catchy tagline. I think they used that a couple of years ago with, cannabis can't cross borders, which we've talked about today is not quite accurate anymore, but the science can, and the standards and the technology can. And so, if you're in, name your state, one on the East Coast that hasn't come online yet, even you as a potential business owner really need to think about, what does 5, 10, 20 years look like? And that's hard to wrap our head around. Even, we're gonna have flying cars in 20 years. I don't know, Back to the Future was a little off on that, but the DeLorean is still an amazing piece of history to think about. But, so think about that, and, look at every other industry that's evolved. 30 years ago, where did we get our fruit and vegetables from? How much of that was imported from international sources? Now we can get kiwis from New Zealand anytime we want now, and all these other products that we wouldn't have thought about. And so how's that going to impact the cannabis industry when, forget interstate commerce, what about international? When Colombia can grow and operate with a labor force and, the equatorial region for, access to sunlight at pennies on the dollar, and even with tariffs, still import and have defined quality for these products. Who's, from a consumer, what do we want to consume? Something that has defined quality, that comes from a unique region, and I can get it cheaper than the product grown down the street indoor in a humid warehouse. Like, those are things we really have to think about as we move forward as an industry. And if we're, looking in our bubble, we're not going to have that perspective. We're going to be blindsided. Gillian, you've got a thought. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I also feel like, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, right? Like a hippie at heart. Like, there's always a desire to buy stuff that's grown in your area, right? To go to the farmer's market, to interact with it, to buy something local, to eat seasonal. So I do think that idea can be sort of drawn out. And that's why I think that every state will have craft cannabis. They will have, homegrown products that people are proud to buy from their state, from their region, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But yeah,
more and more it will be defined by quality. And as we'll have all those segments of industry, but it will be more and more defined by quality aspects. And partly that will be driven by the medicines development, because they are the highest level of quality expectations, but all the way through industry and those different segments we talked about, that will be a defining feature. And particularly what you said, David, all industries are developing in this way. They grow, expand, they change in shape, but more and more is defined by quality.
And maybe just to Gillian's point too, is like, it's not an either or, right? Like, yeah, I go to the farmer's market 2 blocks from my house when it's in season. Love it. I get to know my farmer and buy produce there. But in the absence during the summer, where do I go? I go to a store that I can know and trust. And trust is another key word that I think we overlook in our daily lives. Like, how do we make decisions? It's based on who we know and trust, and that extends to a marketplace at a macro level. So we've really got to think about that as we evolve and carve out our positions in the marketplace wherever you are.
And a throwback to our last webinar where the phrase "Do I trust this banana?" came out. I can't stop thinking about it. Do I trust this banana? So as we are in the last 15 minutes or so of this webinar, public and consumer safety and public health is paramount to this discussion. So I'd like to review and cover the gaps in regulatory compliance and safety standards and how they impact the long-term viability and sustainability of our industries, cannabis and hemp. And obviously, if there's a public health issue, as Gillian mentioned earlier, that could have negative impacts that could involve consumer confidence or brand reputation or worse. So let's talk a little bit about that public safety impact. Gillian?
Yeah, this is where I think minimum standards are the antidote to, the risk that's out there now. Like minimum standards can help mitigate that risk and are absolutely essential. I think they're essential for consumer safety in a couple key areas. One is the safety of product inputs, right? People are making products with a lot of items that are, ingredients that are not just cannabis ingredients. Those ingredients need to be deemed safe for the product, for the method of consumption as well. And there's often a mismatch with the method of consumption, right? Where somebody might use a grass ingredient and think it's safe because it's grass, but they're using it in a vape cartridge, and that's not a grass product. So we've got to have minimum standards and alignment across what it means to have safe product inputs. I think that's also where testing comes in. Then I think minimum standards are needed for manufacturing and processing. And I think that's the part where CGMP comes in. To try to, make sure that the processing and manufacturing process doesn't introduce new contaminants, new concerns, new risks. And then I think minimum standards for packaging and consumer education are also needed. The package needs to communicate to the consumer what is in it, in how many milligrams, in how many servings, what the derivation of ingredients was. I think we have a lot of work to do there. And that brings me to the final thing, which is really consumer education. I think that has been, in my eyes, a big gap across the board, that consumers still, even in states like Washington and Colorado, go in and ask, what's your highest THC product? That consumers may not understand when they're purchasing certain cannabinoid hemp products, what the effect of that product could be on them, in terms of intoxication, in terms of workplace drug testing, all of these things. I think there's just a lot of opportunity to do a better job of helping consumers make decisions about the products they consume, understand what they're consuming, and consume in a responsible way that incorporates harm reduction. So that's my 1 minute synthesis. And somebody wrote in the chat, what is CANNRA doing about all of this? What are we doing about the lack of standardized testing and validated methods? And, we alone will not fix this, but we work really closely with the standard development organizations. We work closely with public health and public safety organizations. We work closely with industry trade associations to try to understand how can we move forward and how can we end up with minimum standards that really do protect consumers and can be implemented in a way that works for everybody. And there are growing pains with regulation, and that's the reality of it. We can try to minimize some of them, but anytime you go from an unregulated substance or space to a regulated substance and space, there's a learning curve. And that's where I think, groups like the GMP Collective can be really helpful to businesses that need to get up to speed on what does it mean to have good manufacturing processes, to follow minimum standards, et cetera.
That's great. Martin, what's your perspective from the international?
Well, again, likewise, it's understanding the use type, medical, and industrial, consumer. Each of those use types will have products associated to them, and each of those products will have an inherent risk associated to it. So that's why we have licensing. Licensing helps decide who can be involved in the industry and what are the scope of activities that they can be involved in. And it's then that we can start developing those applicable standards and what is associated for those products, for that licensed activity, for that industry, for that particular use type. And when we have a lot more clarity about that, that'll be the greatest step that we can take going forward. And certainly that's what the workshop in Philadelphia is about, at least addressing it from medicine's perspective, is addressing some of those aspects. What are the applicable standards for those particular products that we're trying to that we're dealing with? And again, starting with flower first is a really important step, which will have implications and benefits for all segments of the industry.
Absolutely. So I have one more question for you all before we go take a look at some of the audience questions that have come in. So to wrap up the conversation, in your opinion, what are some steps that industry stakeholders, regulators, lawmakers can take so that they can collaborate and proactively address these challenges and shape future regulation and swim together a little better. Martin, let's start with you this time.
Well, our work that ASTM and USP undertook over the last 18 months really showcased how we can move forward together. We got around the table globally, online, a really extraordinarily good group of experts from a diverse group of backgrounds. That's the first step in this, is actually understanding where is the lay of the land and what are the barriers and opportunities that exist for industry to progress and move forward, and regulators and standard organizations within that scope. So I encourage everyone to actually read the recommendations report that's published on United States Pharmacopoeia, because it will give you a good understanding of the common challenges across the globe, but across industries. And I'm sure that hemp and consumer industries will also see that some of the issues there are the same for them. And I think it's when we understand that these are the barriers that we face and the challenges, that we'll be able to actually map out a good roadmap to address them. And that would be on a global scale, would be really fantastic. It would improve transnational trade and quality. So these are all win-wins, particularly for people who are patients.
Mm-hmm. And who would like to access cannabis on their European vacation, wherever they go. David, would you like to add some thoughts here?
Yeah, you know, in many ways, it's so easy that it's hard, right? Like what we're talking about here, listening, educating yourself, you know, listen to Gillian. She just called out, you know, packaging and education as minimums. Listen to Martin, listen to your colleagues, listen to the trade associations that you associate with if you're in industry, right? Listen to the public health associations and what they're saying in academia. We need to bring those perspectives to the table. And while there's no perfect, you know, I'm biased because I'm the vice chair of ASTM's committee, and I'm a huge fan of their 125-year-old process. But watching what Martin, Nandu, and myself were able to pull together during, you know, kind of coming out of the pandemic, where we had representation from 13 nations, with regulators from those nations, with industry from those nations, with academia from those nations, and from trade associations from those organizations and standards groups. We got, you know, we had over 2,000 folks register for those 2 workshops that listened in over 12 hours cumulatively. And so that was our best attempt to date, I would argue, to bring all the diverse perspectives. And again, there's ways to get your voice heard, whether it's public comment period, whether it's calling your, you know, senator or legislator, you know, there's just ways to get involved and listen. So I think, you know, kind of tie that back, participate. If there's one thing you do, participate and pick one place, whether it's your local process, if you've got something going on in the county or the state, or come to ASTM, come listen and participate in the workshop in Philadelphia in June. There's no better way that you can, for $115 a year, get that caliber of information and vote through a vetted consensus process to influence the future of the industry so that we can have true minimum standards that, again, there's no perfect, they're living, breathing documents, but that's the way that we can really create a change that we want to see and have certainty. So hopefully that's my helpful soapbox for the afternoon.
And I would build on what Martin, you and David said, and I would say that regulators must be at the table. And, you know, that has been a slower, more challenging process, in part because there's so much scrutiny over this. Regulators showing up to any standard development organization, you know, conversation and sharing their perspective as a scientist or an expert in that space, that can quickly be construed as a policy, you know, indicator from that jurisdiction. And so that has prevented, I think, regulators from openly participating as experts in the spaces that they are in. And we're working around that to try to engage regulators more, because they have to be at the table to set these minimum standards. And I know Darwin mentioned as a question, what is meant by minimum standards? I say minimum standards because I think the standards set a floor, not a ceiling. And I think that we will have jurisdictions that will opt to add more to those, but we need minimum, we need that floor. Other things that I think we can do, talk with everyone, listen to everyone, even people that you disagree with. This is a very siloed space in my experience, and it can be hard to have walls come down, but I think we're all stronger when we listen to each other and find that common ground. It is there. And I think we need to prioritize the areas where there's common ground. I think one of those should be consumer safety, because consumer safety risks are also risks to businesses. And so the sooner we come up with solutions to protect consumers, the lower the risk is going to be for businesses in this space. And then the last thing I would say is create nimble structures. This is so fast moving. We are talking today about topics that we were not talking about 3-4 years ago, and that will continue to be true. Businesses, to their credit, are very innovative in this space, but that also means that standards and regulatory frameworks need to be nimble to adopt and adjust for those.
And with regards to minimum standards, you know, what are they? They are setting a minimum for assay, for the content that is consistent in that product through time. What are the pesticide, heavy metal limits of that product? What are the microbial limits that are bare minimum for safety? So that's your minimum standards. And then with regards to the risk of medicine, just to address one last question. Yes, medicines are inherently risky as well. And that's often why we have controls on them, often why they're prescribed, and they involve a prescriber pharmacy model of care. And I think for cannabis, this is where we need to actually start approaching as a medicine, excuse me, sorry, is that the prescriber and pharmacy are involved in that level of care, and that the quality is up to a level that they have assurance as a health professional that they can reliably prescribe that to their patient to treat and manage disease. So minimum standards and risk really matter across all of this. And again, that's why I think ASTM's put that effort into developing this upcoming workshop where we'll address a lot of these issues.
Thank you all so much. We only have about a minute left. I don't know that we have time to address any of the really great questions. Something like 16, 17 questions have come in either through Q&A or pre-registration. We've had an opportunity to answer a couple of them. We'll see if we can address any of these in the follow-up email that I'll send in a few days that'll contain the recording of this webinar. So in case you joined us late or you want to send this along or rewatch it, it'll also be on the GMP Collective's YouTube channel. David, would you like to add anything before I just wrap up here?
I think this is great. I'm just so grateful for Martin waking up super early over in New Zealand. He's a little, day ahead of us, but thank you for being on the cusp of the future. And Gillian, as always, thank you so much for bringing your perspectives. I think the regulators' perspectives that you guys bring is invaluable. As you said, we need everybody to have a seat at the table. It's not that easy to just have folks unfiltered come and just, share perspectives. It's challenging and complicated, but by doing so in a safe space and being constructive and bringing evidence and data to inform your perspectives, I think we have maybe the best chance in history to date to really create a future framework that actually works. So thank you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. We've come a long way. We've got plenty to go too. Thanks to all of our audience members for tuning in today, and thanks to our guests, Martin and Gillian, for adding their expertise. I already mentioned that all of our past episodes and this one will be available on our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in learning more about the GMP Collective, head to thegmpcollective.com or find us on LinkedIn. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next month.
See you guys. Have a great day.